role of plagues in late 20th and 21st century Latin American culture as a central figure used to develop discussions about monoculture, infrastructure, and socioeconomic issues. She traveled to Colombia and accessed the archives of the National Library of Colombia and the Banco de la República. And with that, here we go. Thank you.
So I can see the slides. Can I do this? Okay, hello everyone. I'm gonna do my best here to. Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, yes, that's perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about my dissertation proposal in progress. Still, I wish I would finish it by now. I'm sorry, Michelle. And I'm going to talk about where I'm at and how this fellowship helped me to move forward specifically with my method. So I'm interested in exploring intergenerational relationships with nature in El Salvador. Next slide, please. Of course, I'm going to start giving some background. You know, El Salvador is a Central American country, tropical, humid. We only have Pacific Ocean compared to other Central American countries that have both oceans. We have volcanoes, earthquakes, biodiversity, and of course, next slide. As a colonized country, we have wounds, we have stitches, we have scars in our lands. And this comes from a long history since we were invaded in 1524 by the Spaniards. We have a long history and patterns of genocide, ethnocide, ecocide, extractivism, authoritarianism. Of course, all of these topics, require a presentation on their own. I'm not here to go into detail, but you can see that these have been patterns throughout our history. And they're still present today. In the 1980s, we had a conflict. We had a war in the country, and that picture is from those times, and it's trenches that were built by the revolutionary movement. So in the last one, the cooptation of nature for nationalism, that's something that in the next slide, I can show a recent example. Yes, I can show a recent example, right, where we have a political figure, right, in the center, with official social media, and this, our current president, right, in constitutional, is talking about, could you go back? Yes, further back, actually. I think you went forward too much. Yeah, there you go. So he's talking about a food insecurity problem that we have in the country, right? As you know, that's a product of climate change, environmental injustice. People don't have food to eat. So we have here on this, you can go on Instagram and find this, right? I'm not making it up. And you'll see him, right, as, a cool person who will, him in the center, going to solve our food problem with monoculture, right, which is part of the problem. And on the right, we have this weird conflation between now we are not a violent country, right? Our security policies have functioned. Therefore, nature can shine, right? Come and see and enjoy our nature in the way of surfing. Next slide, please. There's a lot more to say, right? In contrast, right? In contrast to the previous image that, gives you the idea that El Salvador is a thriving country, which I see that as a really successful media campaign. This is also the reality for the majority of Salvadorans, right? Droughts, floods that are messing up with the crops, more difficulty accessing drinkable water, which impacts mostly women, and there's a lot of consequences that, of course, come with that. And then the most visible expression of forced migration caused by environmental and climate injustice are migrant caravans, right? That's what we can see here in the US, and that's what most people are outraged about, but that's the most visible expression of this problem. So in addition to the human problem, right, in addition to the challenges that a lot of communities are facing, this also is reflected by the loss of biodiversity. An example of it is this species which is called yellow-naped Amazon. It's endemic to this part of Central America, and it's also critically endangered. And that matches the areas where people are also fleeing from, right? So there is a connection between loss of biodiversity, endemic species, and forced migration. So as a psychologist, I have mostly worked in mental health issues, right? And in my career, I have mostly worked with forced migration and mental health support systems for those fleeing those places. After realizing this connection between environmental injustice and climate refugees, or refugees and displacement, I moved my topic to forced migration and environmental and climate injustice, right? Most of us as mental health professionals are just putting the Band-Aid to a lot of the problems, and we rarely get to go to the causes and structures of those problems. So that's what I'm hoping to start digging a little bit more. And this topic shift can be said in another way, which is that I believe in the right to migrate with dignity and also in the right to remain with dignity, because a lot of people don't want to leave, right? Most people actually want to stay. Next one, please. So the purpose of my research is to make critical psychological research and practice useful to environmental and climate justice efforts in El Salvador and the Central American Dry Corridor. I'm going to come back to this briefly, right? This long history of patterns of destruction, exploitation, othering, discrimination. And of course, for all of this to happen, there are social consequences, but there's also psychological consequences, and there's also psychosocial consequences. So I'm also interested in that. Could you go to the next one? So how do these systems that we talked about in the previous slide, how do these social forces, structures, and processes contributed to shape the psychological relationship with nature of Salvadorans, right? And nature understood as land, water, air, flora, and fauna, right? How have these big structures shaped how we psychologically relate to nature? That's, I would say, an overarching question, right? That's a question I have in the background. And that becomes concrete with the research questions that are, how do 3 generations remember nature in El Salvador? How do 3 generations make sense of the relationship with nature? And how do 3 generations make sense of environmental exploitation, decay, protection, and regeneration? And these 4 are really important because a lot of communities have dealt with exploitation and decay, and that's the majority of the people. But also in the country, you do have a lot of people fighting to protect, and some of them have actually managed to regenerate some of the ecosystem. So I'm also interested in that other aspect. So the theoretical frame, I'm going to be super brief here because that's not what I'm going to focus on. Could you go next slide, please? I'm drawing from many places. Right now, I'm just going to talk about the first column on the left, which is liberation psychology. Liberation psychology as constructed partly by Ignacio Martín Baró, a social psychologist in El Salvador who was assassinated in 1989 in the middle of the war, precisely because his work was uncomfortable for those in power. So again, I'm sorry I cannot go through all of that, but it's impossible. Could you go next slide, please? So one of the main critiques that Martín Baró and a lot of critical psychologists make to the field of psychology is how we have the tendency to psychologize everything. And that means make individual social problems, right? Make micro something that's macro. And that comes in many ways. In one of the ways that shows up is the solutions that we try to, and the explanations to the problems that we offer. This cartoon, I think, really summarizes very well a lot of what psychology does, which is ignoring the context. So I'm hoping to be mindful and careful with that, given that I'm working with psychology. So in the middle of the war, 3 years before he was killed, Martín Baró came up with, or summarized from the work of other Latin American scholars as well, 3 urgent tasks to achieve a liberation psychology that will support the social struggles of the majorities of the people, in this case, in Central America. And he talks about 3 urgent tasks: the recovery of historical memory, and as we know, any system of oppression will try to make us forget, right? Will try to make us forget our ancestry, or relationships, or practices. So the recovery of historical memory is essential for that. And I'm making there like an addition and saying, yes, historical memory is important. A lot of people in Latin America are doing that. And in social psych, at least, in my experience, has been mostly focused on human to human memory, not human and the environment, right? It's mostly focused on humans. The second one is the ideologizing everyday experience. That, in said in another way, means how can we scrutinize those things that have been made normal to us, right? Certain things in our society, we have grown to believe they're just normal, right? So we have come to take for granted, for example, that humans are better than nature, or that we are at the top of the pyramid, that we have the right to dominate it. Of those things we take for granted, right? So for Martin Baró is how can we use research to question those things we take for granted, and specifically about nature. And the third one is utilizing people's virtues. And in that, he's referring to what are the strengths of social communities, in which ways communities have resisted and struggled against environmental destruction, and how can we retrieve those lessons from the past, right? And not just thinking of them as, oh, poor forced migrants, they have nothing to contribute or resistance necessarily. I am suggesting two other tasks, which is a psychology for the right to remain and a psychology towards regeneration. I wonder what makes someone to build and work towards regeneration in the middle of doom, right? In the middle of destruction, right? I'm very interested in that. Next one. Next slide, please. So coming back to my overarching question, how have social forces, structures, processes contributed to shape our psychological relationship with nature? And to get to that, I'm going to use environmental photography of El Salvador produced between these years, 25 and 2000, as a method to open up these narratives. Next slide, please. And now, finally, we're going to what I did in El Salvador. I'm not going to talk about all the methods. Of course, this is in progress. Just focus on the first two. So I'm trying to open up conversations with Salvadorans about their memories of the environment, right? All I have are pictures. What pictures do I choose, right? I'm going to create an interview that's going to be somehow in my head, right, as a researcher, representative of the environmental milestones or important moments. For example, the introduction of plastics in the 20th century, the introduction of pesticides, the construction of railroads, the construction of dams. All of this happened in the context of modernization, right? So I'm looking for those pictures because a lot of people I know and I grew up with in El Salvador could tell me about those situations, but they didn't have any single photograph of it, right? Just memories. So I'm looking for that. And I'm going to create, again, photo elicitation interviews to bring up conversations with people about what were they doing, what memories do they have, how was it for them to engage with it. And the process of coming up with the photographs and curating them is a big challenge for me right now, and that's what I'm focused on. Could you go on the next one? So this is what I found when I went to El Salvador. I'm like, okay, what's out there in terms of pictures, right? It's a global south country. We don't own a lot of the images. A lot of the images are made by transnational companies, right, that have an interest in selling the country to international investors. So I'm wondering how are images, how is this visual production aimed to shape certain perspectives? So in my trip to El Salvador in the summer, am I done? 1 minute? Oh, okay. So, well, with the funding, this is what I did. I went to El Salvador. I interviewed and I consulted with local experts, historians, librarians, environmental activists, and cultural researchers. I'm trying to get a sense of what was happening in the 50s in El Salvador, in the countryside, right? I'm talking to people from different parts of the country, or the cultural researcher I asked, what images were popular in the 60s and 70s? You have talked to a lot of the communities, over the years. What was like a popular postal card, for example, of El Salvador going around? Because I want to make sure I bring things that are also have some level of familiarity for people, right? But at the same time, they might have not seen them at all. So that pushes me to think about how am I selecting these images in terms of copyright, format, access. I did an informal test with my grandma, right? I got one, and if you can go to the next one, and I think I'm just going to end there because of time. So this is one of the publications with images that I found in my trip to El Salvador, right? Thanks to these consultations. It's a National Geographic magazine that's trying to highlight the beauty of the coffee industry in El Salvador. And it has lots of pictures, right? And I just had my tablet. I got this really good quality image because of the field work I did, because of some his librarians share this magazine. And I showed it to my grandma, and I'm like, hey, I'm just gonna show you pictures, and you tell me what comes up, right? And she got really upset with this one because she's like, look, that's all those clothes are very nice. That's not how I was dressing. And I'm telling my grandma because she grew up doing this, right? I didn't wear these clothes. These were like the super rich clothes. Second, all the beans in the coffee thing are red, are ripe. That never happens. It's always red and green, right? Then she said, look at that like basket. It's full, right? It's all full and flat. Like that never happens either. And then from there, she started telling me about her relationships, some of the people she met. She also told me some of the techniques she had to learn as a little kid to make sure that the coffee had space. And those techniques had to do with cutting certain native plants and native fruits that she would eat from. But now she was cutting her own food while she was working, right? Anyway, that's just like a super brief example, and I'm not gonna say anything else because of time, but if you can just go through the slides, and I'm just gonna share some of the other pictures that are coming from the country. Yeah, keep going. I took these pictures. These are culturally relevant birds also. I'm interested in seeing if also like species bring up certain conversations. Next one. Also just a bird that has very ancestral roots. And that's it. I'm going to stop there. Sorry for taking more time, and thank you for listening.
Well, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
You're sharing your screen, right?
Yes, I'll do a screen share.
Can you share?
Sure. Is that working? All right, can you just confirm you see the screen? See the screen? Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Sorry.
can. We can.
Okay, wonderful. All right. All right, so I thank you. First, just want to say thank you to the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, Latino Studies. Thank you to fellow grantees for your presentations, and thank you for those in attendance. Today, as a visual aid, I will just be playing in the background here, and it might just be on loop. This is in Brazil, you call it like a benfeitoria. I guess in the US, it's like, like a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe type campaign that I've been working on with a local beach cleanup group in Bahia, Brazil. And so we're going to be using this video to kind of convey the current trash problem that's going on in the mangrove, the river ecosystem and the seashore, the Restinga. And this will kind of just be playing in the background for you to see the visuals as I speak about the field site. So in presenting today, I want to paint a picture of the general setting of, I guess, what anthropologists call the field site for my dissertation research site, and include some of the communities and actors that have captured my In doing this, I hope to convey the breadth and complexity involved in conducting anthropological ethnographic field research, which involves, local struggles and urgent global industrial scale environmental problems. The research in this specific site began rather unexpectedly for me. I was visiting the region of Peninsula Marau, which you can see in the video here, in southern Bahia, in an attempt to escape from urban noise, to find quieter pastures. We were about 10 months into the COVID pandemic, and I found that I was way less anxious and stretched when I was away from the urban centers. My goal was to go to a quiet, remote beach and connect with the natural elements, connect with the ocean, and find a way to kind of, let's say, connect to my inner voice or connect with myself. I thought that I would be further away from the human-centric distractions, and I might be able to hear myself more clearly. However, upon arriving to this quiet beach, away from all the noise, this more egocentric goal of mine was interrupted because I found myself swimming with a bunch of residue. And so what I thought would be a pristine beach was really just being washed over with tons and tons of plastic and other types of residue. Each new tide brought more, and my time there coincided with record rainstorms. It was actually the rainiest January in the state's history, the first time I was there, since they began collecting weather data. The residue washing ashore included many plastic lids, bottle caps, water bottles, chip bags, straws, camera lens caps, candy wrappers, USB sticks, hair combs, flip-flops, sneakers, Legos, Barbie legs, plastic toys, shampoo bottles, often even kids' toys that were the actual marine animals themselves. So it's quite eerie to, for instance, to see a plastic fish while you're walking along the seashore. In addition to all these plastics of all shapes and sizes was also little bits of its raw material fossil ancestor, black clouds of petroleum, which were likely leftovers from an oil spill off the Brazilian coast, or perhaps from more recent unacknowledged smaller oil spills that might be happening any day. Estimates suggest by like 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean. So I was really angry. I was disgusted at this site. And once I became aware of it, it was kind of everywhere in many scales. So you'd see either a large refrigerator, or you could see, just loop it in, from scales from a large refrigerator to just little bits of broken down plastic that were basically difficult to differentiate from the grains of sand. But why was I so angry, I thought? Why do these synthetic artificial items, why do they look so out of place in this landscape? Do I even know why it's so bad or detrimental to the ecosystem? And is it really that detrimental? It was just a feeling really at first. Although I did recognize that part of my anger was because in a way I saw my reflection in these items. I, at one point or another, or even in an everyday manner, had used each and every item that I came upon on the shore. Collecting the trash, whether on the beach or a river shore in any landscape, is a meditation I recommend for everyone. It allows us to face our trash, or if you excuse my language, face our shit, which is representative of a larger societal norm of ignoring the material waste that we as a species generate. I began to inquire with locals about this trash. Were others noticing this? Was anyone doing something about it? In inquiring, and began meeting with different players involved and communities that are being disproportionately affected by the plastic plot stem, and those that are striving to tackle the issue. I encountered many local theories about how the plastic was getting there, but it was clear that the washup was a lot larger after the heavy rains. And so it became evident that heavy rains upriver was causing a lot of material to wash onto the river, travel downstream, and then wash up along the shore near the river's mouth. And this is something that's repeated globally. So what's happening in this river is happening in tropical rivers around the entire world. And so it can operate as a good case study or a parallel study to other rivers worldwide. Unexpected levels of rainfall damaged infrastructure throughout towns and ruptured two dams, one on the Rio de Contas, which is the river we're speaking of, a river that begins around 500 kilometers inland and feeds into open ocean in the southern point of Peninsula Marau. Many towns along this river do not have sanitation infrastructure, and so the rains wash tons of debris downriver. A viral video on Instagram showed an entire house floating downriver after one of these heavy storms. The record rains brought murkiness to the crystalline seawater and tides carrying tons of ecologic and human waste to the Bahian Ocean that tourists come to swim and play in. The Bahian Ocean that tourists come to swim and pray in was no longer safe to enter. It was as if Iemanjá, the maternal sea goddess that is celebrated and worshipped throughout Bahia and the Black Atlantic, is rejecting the waste and returning it to us, her children. Just here for the sake of time. So once I began asking around, many folks pointed me to the same person, and this was Batista, who you see in the video as well. Who is a local shaman of sorts, and is sometimes referred to as o Salvador das Tartarugas, or Protetor das Tartarugas in Portuguese, which translates to savior or protector of the turtles. Batista moved to this region about 30 years ago, and he, while walking along the shore on his own, witnessed a turtle birth, and according to him, had a vision that this is what he would dedicate his life to. He has a tattoo of a sea turtle in front of his heart and behind it in his back between his shoulders. Batista founded and heads a local association called Tartaru, which is run by him and a few assistants and a rotation of volunteers and occasional interns. He and his co-workers refer to themselves as Tartarugueiros, which translates roughly to turtle person or turtler, as a fazendeiro is a farmer, one who farms, or a guerreiro is a warrior, one that battles. A tartarugueiro is one that turtles or works with turtles. Associação Tartaru, which is the organization he founded, monitors a 10-kilometer stretch of seashore daily for indications of sea turtle nests. Though it is not their primary focus, the tartarugueiros have ended up collecting plastics and other residuals as they ride their motorcycles along the water's edge during low tide to monitor the shore. The plastics often get in the way of sea turtle births, and it's already such a small percentage of the newborn turtles that actually make it to survive in the ocean, that having plastics and other residue in their way pretty much would lead, what Batista believes would lead to extinction for the turtles that have been birthing here for what's estimated as over 1,000 years. So the eggs take about 45 days to hatch. Batista marks his calendar and makes sure to open up the netting when he believes the eggs are nearing to hatch. He often witnesses the birth process and acts as a guardian while the baby turtles rush to sea. The tartarugueiros have more recently begun to operate as researchers and data collectors as they work to keep records of the births and their findings. Research and data is somewhat of a requirement these days if the small organization such as Tartaru is going to make any sort of environmental claim to government agencies, or if they hope to raise funding to sustain their efforts. So whether it's donors or larger NGOs or government agencies, all of these are requiring numbers and data, hard data from local activists and local workers such as the Tartarugueiros, which has caused them to start looking into technology such as GIS and working with interns to figure out ways to keep data of the work they do every year. So some struggles that I'm coming upon in my research on the field involves one of them is the scope of the problem, right? The plastic residue affects many different scales in different ways. And the toxicity of plastics is something that has been shown to seep into our endocrine system and our blood. Plastics challenge scientific methods of data collection because the plastics and their components transform as they break down. How to balance or bring into conversation the hard and social sciences in this case has been a challenge for me. They seem like two distinct realms of knowledge with different methodologies, but they're also so intertwined in the mangrove and Restinga ecosystems. In this next phase of my research, I hope to find methods that incorporate more data collection and hard science methodologies to assist local measures. The situation is an urgent one, and for this reason, I intend the research to bring direct and immediate support, as well as applicable data and knowledge to the groups tackling plastic pollution. It is vital to recognize that plastics accumulating ashore as more than merely harmful intruders to an ecosystem, and yes, reverberations of an enduring violence by the oil, building, and food industry, and the states that enable their production and circulation. In adhering to a participatory action and activist scholar approach, I've worked with locals to create a beach cleanup group that continues leading 2 beach cleanups each month and coordinating the logistics to get the collected residue to proper municipal waste centers. However, the problem does not stop there, as some of these centers send the material to incineration centers and others to a lishon, or large landfill, where the materials are just left to rot. My background in filmmaking, I have a background in filmmaking and like to think about the field site as a setting with a cast of players. In this case, some of the players involved include riverside communities, activist groups, a holistic retreat center, a Tupinamba village, a Quilombo mangrove community, regional spiritual and ecological leaders, small business owners, fishermen and fisheries, global shipping, hydroelectric dams, municipal waste workers, tourists, environmental protection agencies, large multinationals, NGOs, food packaging, weather and climate patterns, indigenous and Afro-diasporic cosmologies, international development and conservation, industrial farming, and tourism development, to name a few. Specifically, my project asks, how is the increasing influx of plastic pollution theorized, acted upon, and acted upon by distinct communities along the same river? To answer this, we ask what resiliency measures and potential solutions are being developed and taken by residents and activists. What sorts of settler-colonial land relations, assumptions, and forms of violence are involved? And how do we evaluate the violence and toxicity towards the different communities? There are more questions that come about when thinking through these. Some of these include what interspecies alliances are formed, which relations matter most and at which scales, what short and long-term solutions are local groups more focused on, and what are their challenges? What are discard practices like upriver? How are plastics utilized, conceptualized by different communities in the region? And what kind of meanings, desires, affects, and histories emerge from local populations' everyday interactions with purchased plastics, as well as river shore and seashore plastic? How do we measure the toxicity to residents and to the ecosystem? And how do we account for the increasing tourist, agriculture, and state development that continue to transform the region? Moving forward, my work will need to crystallize this complexity into a written dissertation with a visual component, as well as real-world, immediately applicable activist components. As I mentioned, there are many players and scales involved. I admit that I'm having trouble in the more academic and theoretical aspect of the research project. So if anyone listening has work they could point me toward or suggest, or would like to chat with me about how I can narrow or focus in, I'd be happy to chat. Please reach out, and thank you all.
Funciona. Sí, ok. Ya. Aquí estoy. Gracias.
Okay, thank you so much. So as you can see, the title changed, but it's basically the same idea. Plagues, monocultures, and agribusiness in contemporary Latin American cultural productions. In 1945, the United Fruit Company established the first commercial plantation of oil palm in Colombia, marking the beginning of a significant shift in the country's agricultural landscape. Before this, the same company had already established oil palm and banana plantations in various regions of Colombia, Central America, and the Caribbean, making it a significant player in agribusiness. Fast forward to February 2023, the Agriculture Ministry of Colombia estimated that the oil palm is the largest monocrop in the country, covering a sprawling 600,000 hectares. However, agribusiness, especially in the monoculture area, has been associated with a series of violent dynamics involving armed actors, the state, and multinational companies. The monoculture system has also played a significant role in the devastation of the territory, disrupting ecosystemic relations and leading to the emergence of the plagues, public health issues, and other related problems that have had far-reaching implications. Well-known cultural productions such as La Vorágine in 1924 by José Eustacio Rivera and 100 Years of Solitude in 1967 by Gabriel García Márquez have portrayed the violence perpetrated by the investment of multinational companies such as the United Fruit Company in the agro-industrial business in Colombia. My research aims to explore the role of plagues in late 20th and 21st century Latin American culture as a central figure used to develop discussions about monoculture, infrastructure, and socioeconomic issues. I am interested in investigating how the figure of the plague is being used as a way to articulate the different problems while drawing attention to the development of agriculture and infrastructure in the early 20th century. By studying the cultural productions that center around the plague, I hope to track and understand how the plague became so central in certain cultural narratives, shedding light on its significance and impact in Latin America. This is, an ongoing research, and I am still exploring the case of contemporary Colombian cultural productions, but I'm also open to other regions of Latin America, and with the Clacls Summer Research Fellowship, I also did some research in other places. Two cases of contemporary cultural productions where the plague appears as a central agent of the story that articulates issues about agro-industry, infrastructure, and state violence are the novels El Diablo de las Provincias, The Devil of the Provinces in 2017 by Juan Cárdenas, and Plaga in 2021 by Juliana Javierre. In Plaga, a plague of flies appears as a character that articulates issues of health, precariousness, state violence, and gender in a town in Colombia. On the other hand, in El Diablo de las Provincias, the plague is incorporated as a tool that reveals the relationship between armed violence, palm oil plantations, and the role of certain local elites in Colombia. In both novels, the presence of plagues becomes a topic of debate surrounding public health, violence produced by different armed actors and the state, and the consequences of monoculture plantations for human and non-human life. In these two novels, the plague proliferates through the narrative itself, making visible the environmental resurrection that Jane Sanderman attributes to the stories of Horacio Quiroga and other 20th century narratives. Identifying and assimilating the form of monoculture as a plague implies giving new meaning to this industrial form, highlighting how it brings long-term violent consequences. Through these two cases, it's possible to see how Marco Armeiro termed the Wastocene operates and it is a designation that can only be understood within the framework of the Capitalocene, and it operates and emphasizes, quote, the contaminated nature of capitalism and its persistence within the fabric of life. These two cultural productions allude to historical contexts of extractive and neo-colonial practices portraying a present plagued by violent neoliberal policies. With the help of the 2024 Clacls Summer Research Fellowship, I was able to advance the research to expand my corpus into other geographies from Latin America and Iberoamerica. Films like Aquarius by the Brazilian Cleber Mendoza Filho, O Que Arde by the Galician Oliver Laje, and novels like Mugre Rosa by Uruguayan Fernanda Trias and Autobiografía del Algodón by Mexican Cristina Rivera Garza, among others, are some of the contemporary cultural productions that have also portrayed the environmental crisis with the figure of the plague as a protagonist, while talking about infrastructure, monoculture, and the body. While I am still unsure whether these cultural productions will be part of my dissertation as they are produced and contextualized in multiple and diverse Latin American and Iberian contexts, it is and was also crucial for this part of my research to understand and expand on the contemporary cultural landscape. While this part of the research during the summer was done on contemporary cultural production across Latin America and Iberoamerica, a significant part of the research I did with the Clacls Summer Research Fellowship was conducted within the Colombian context. With the fellowship, I traveled to Colombia to conduct archival research on the Biblioteca Nacional de Colombia and the Banco de la República. This archival research aimed to gain a deeper understanding of the historical context of monocultural agribusiness in Colombia, especially during the 20th century. Certain aspects of this history have had a significant resonance, such as the United Fruit Company's history in Central America and Colombia related to the banana. Artistical projects like La Fiebre de la Banana, Banana Craze, created by Juanita Solano and Blanca Serrano, show how a natural resource such as the banana has shaped the past and the present of a continent, and how this phenomenon finds expression through culture. However, the impact other monocultural systems have created in Latin America, specifically in Colombia, is still unexplored, even though there has been resonance in 20th and 21st century cultural productions. As mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, the United Fruit Company not only brought banana plantations to Colombia, but it also established in 1945 the first commercial plantation of oil palm in Colombia. Within the archives of the National Library and the Banco de la República, I found materials from early 20th century that show how cartographical production shaped and influenced the extractive policies and monocultural agriculture forms in Colombia in the 20th century. While my initial concern was to dig into the socioeconomic process that helped develop monocultural production in Colombia, this archival research led me to dig into productions made during the 20th century that sought to portray Colombia's political, economic, geographical, and historical aspects, which were used as a form of showing Colombia's rich and diverse landscape for investment and market opportunities for foreign companies. Among these archives, I explored the Libro Azul de Colombia, Blue Book of Colombia, written by Jorge Posada Callejas and published in 1918 under the government of the then conservative president, José Vicente Concha. His presidency was from 1914 to 1918, which contains an, quote, abridged history of the Republic, and was created to promote a commercial foreign interest in Colombia. This book includes detailed information about agriculture, commerce, essential products, and geographical accounts of Colombia, among other matters, and it's written in Spanish and English. The section, Some Important Products in Colombia, describes products like coffee, rubber, and of course, bananas. The description of the banana accounts for the infrastructural development that was done along with the banana plantations. And I quote from the book. From Santa Marta to Ciénaga, there is a stretch of land 34 kilometers long, traversed by a railroad and planted on both sides with cocoa, sugarcane, and the common plantain, and embellished with various kinds of fruit trees of careful selection. In this zone, there is only one relatively large area planted with the regular banana. This is the Papare Hacienda, whose owner has 20 hectares under cultivation. From Ciénaga to Rio Frio, it is 13.5 kilometers along the same railroad. In this zone, which is planted with banana, there is a stretch of 2 kilometers not cultivated on account of its brackish soil. These lands belong to the district of Ciénaga. In this part, the operations of the United Fruit Company are also mentioned, explain how the company helps local cultivators and how it took the banana business in the region. This description shows how the blue books, also created in Central America, in El Salvador, I think maybe in 1917, 16 maybe, I'm not sure, were designed to promote foreign interests in Colombia's diverse and usable landscape. I also consulted cartographical materials such as the Atlas de Colombia of 1967, organized by the Instituto Geográfico Agustín Codazzi, which contains detailed information on the historical cartographical production in Colombia, as well as information about the economic, culture, political administration, and thorough knowledge on each of the departments of Colombia. These documents and books show how the development of agricultural business in the country while promoting investment for foreign companies, as in the case of the Blue Books. Although my project will most likely be centered around contemporary cultural productions like El Diablo de las Provincias and Plague, tracing the historical development of monocultural systems and the development of infrastructural and commercial relations within the context of the 20th century is crucial for this research, as this historical context is also acknowledged in some of the most valuable literature pieces of the 20th century in Colombia. That is La Vorágine, a novel that is turning this year 100 years old and in which Rivera tells the story of the rubber fever. And 100 Years of Solitude, published in Spanish in 1967, which, as it is well known, tells the story of the banana fever in the north of Colombia. And I am not studying these two novels, but these are the most important precedents. These two literary works serve as a precedent for the emerging cultural productions of and the return to the extractivist violent history in Colombia under the plantation and agro-industrial systems led and reinforced by neoliberal policies. Sorry. Thanks.
Oh,
Yes, for the video.
okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentations. I have a question for Choco. So the photos that you showed, I have two questions because you explained, like I guess the limits or the kind of disciplinary boundaries of psychology, right? Like starts by this centering the human. So, and this is, I guess, a challenge for anyone who's trying to write about this stuff. But how do you think you're gonna undo in a way this binary between the human and nature? Because within the realm of nature, you put land, flora, fauna, but then at the same time on your theoretical kind of like marco teórico, right? You have Tsing and Haraway, who precisely are trying to undo that binary, right? Like to seeing humans as part of the environment within the web of life, etc. So I guess that is a kind of like a very broad and complex question. And the second is like the analysis of images. I think it's very compelling, and the reading that you did of National Geographic is excellent. So how are you going to consider the difference between photos that you are taking of different, birds and stuff like that, and then images that were meant for consumption that circulated widely, in publications such as National Geographic that are actually creating these publics, and a visuality of this landscape that is completely different from the one that you can offer as just like, I don't know, kind of day-to-day documentation of your own. It's like different kinds of images, right? So that's, yeah. And Vale, we can talk.
Is this working? Yes. Okay. Those are very challenging questions, and I will deal with them throughout my dissertation. I've been really, because in my presentation, in the title, it says relationships with nature. Like, so from the beginning, I'm actually pretty much like buying into or playing with that binary. Why am I doing that? Because the people who I'm going to interview, that's the binary that makes sense and is relevant culturally for them. And if I say, I'm here to explore with you your relationship with more than humans, like that's just gonna, it's not gonna fly, right? So it's more of a consideration to the context and the historical moment where people are, not to say that discussion about the binary, that's something that I hope to develop in conversation with what people say and the people's responses and the interviews and all of that. I don't know exactly where I'm going to land. I don't even know if psychology is the right field to even participate in this, right? Because also psychology appropriates a lot of indigenous knowledge and co-ops it, right? So I'm even dealing with that. These are just, I would say, the words that allow me to carry on the conversation with certain folks. Like, for example, with my grandma, that just talking to her helped me to. So it's like a practical reason, but I'm not leaving the critique of the binary. I'm not forgetting about that. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. And the second question is, what's the difference between my photos? So I'm using, yes, my photos are like a last thing. I'm not a photographer. I'm really like just moving to something I was very familiar with to something I'm very new to. So I'm taking photographs of birds because it's part of my own experience, understanding images, photographs, audiences, purposes, right? And I'm also including family photos, right, from those who have them from the participants. Of course, it's more likely that middle class and people with more money and access to cameras, for example, and access to protect those images might have more family photos. So there's something there to say about access to technology, and about also the material conditions to protect visual data. And also the purposes, right? Because the purpose of the United Fruit Company, right? The United Fruit Company was not in El Salvador, but they did have the railroad there, right? For example. So I would be interested in like what would be the difference between those three types of photographs. And I'm hoping to somehow navigate the intimate, the family, the community to the corporate transnational lens. And see how those different lenses or layers of making sense of images or purposes to create images speak to each other. Again, I'm still very new to all of this, but that's how I'm thinking about it. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I have a question / comment for Choco. It's not the main part of your presentation, but you had that picture of the surfer and this depiction of like now that El Salvador has experienced this decline in crime, you can come experience in nature, and you talked a bit about this. I would love to hear more if you had any more to add to that, because I'm not sure if I'm maybe you're actually pretty well aware, but in the US, there's a huge discussion on El Salvador and this very like carceral treatment towards young men works, even though of course we have so much evidence that it's not. Like it's just reactionary. And so I would love to hear more about you and that picture.
Okay. I know I already responded one question, so I saw also other hands, so I'm happy to respond, but also I don't know if other people would like to offer other questions. Okay. Oh. Right. I'll keep that question in mind.
In your presentation, you mentioned something about the loss of biodiversity due to the forced of migration. I have a question about that. Due to the force of migration, what specific environmental challenges have you had, like when you were over there, the chance to observe in regions with high rates of migration, and especially in relation to the biodiversity? And also if it affected the agriculture and any natural resources, specifically like exploitation.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna be super brief. I would say that the loss of biodiversity is connected to forced migration. Forced migration is not necessarily causing the loss of biodiversity, but because biodiversity is is dying in many ecosystems, and the ecosystems cannot provide some of the basic things that humans take from them, right? So that I would just like to make that clarification. And yes, you see more people coming to. I'm not working directly with forced migrants right now, but I do know people in Central America who are working with them, not only from Central America, but we know that's a corridor from people coming from, Asia, Africa, and many other places. So a lot of them will say, they will not tell you, I'm here because of environmental injustice, right? I'm here because the river in my community dried out, right? I'm here because all the trees that bear fruit in our homeland and we use for different seasons are gone, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't come out as with certain words, but they do talk about the evidence or the environmental consequences they see. So for a lot of people who are working there in that place right now, it's extremely frustrating. That I can tell you. It's extremely just sad that you are seeing people who are moving and trying to come. You're trying to support them. There's not enough resources, and all you can have is empathy and humanity, and at least not to keep victimizing them more than the system has already done. So it's a pretty complicated situation. And that question, I'd like to explain it separate, because that's that's a lot.
Thank you very much. Have 5 minute break. Sí, pero pues sí.
4:15 y después hasta las 5:30 tenemos tiempo.
Ah, ok. 3:15.
Tenemos
3:15
de
empieza.
3:15.
Ah, súper.
No sé qué pensar de ella. Hola, Mónica. Mucho gusto. Mónica. María. No, soy María Mónica, pero todos me dicen Mónica. Ah, ok. Las dos están bien igual, pero sí, de preferencia.
Okay.
Sí, sí, sí.
Hola.
Hola, mucho gusto.
Soy Fátima.
Ay, gusto.
Ay, perdónenos que cuando hicimos el afiche.
Ay, no te preocupes. No, igual sabes que yo tardé en, bueno, creo
Qué bueno que te diste cuenta.
sí, no,
Menos
no,
mal.
porque justo no estoy tomando una clase por venir, entonces le dije al profe, por eso estaba como, de que
Ajá.
necesito que salga mi nombre.
Sí, sí. No, pero muy importante. Gracias por
Sí,
decirnos.
no,
Sí.
Causa está en live.
No. Ay, juepucha. Son muchas cosas.
Sí, no, yo me imagino que se va a tardar un poco más que como en responder, pero hace poco hubo una convocatoria sobre reportajes. Como yo
Una invitación.
sí.
Ok.
Yo me imagino que están digo a full con esto.
Entonces, si no voy a hablar. Voy a buscar el video. Esta semana el comité se gracias por reunirse para chequear las aplicaciones, evaluar, tomar las decisiones.